of my favorite genres of film is Keira Knightley, Joe Wright collaborations. Like Pride and Prejudice from 2005, 2007, Atonement, Library Scene, like, need I say more? And then Anna Karenina in 2012. All three masterpieces of cinema. A few months ago, I was in Fabricland and I saw this purple fabric that reminded me so much of the dress from Anna Karenina. And it was $1 a meter. So I bought all of it. And when I took it home and I looked at photos from the movie, I was like, oh, it's actually not that similar at all, but they're both purple, so perfect. So I thought, why not recreate this dress and just see how close I can get with spending as little time as possible and spending as little money as possible. My goal was to spend not $1 more than what I'd spent on the fabric. And this is that story. So the first thing to do was taking my measurements over my corset. And then it was time to start sewing. So I started with the most inner garment, which is a bum roll. And bum hats have been used for hundreds of years. We've been wearing these since like the 16th century. So on this day, I put hundreds of years of history to shame by making this bum pad in the most haphazard and chaotic way possible. So basically, I took some factory cotton and I just do a big kind of croissant shape on the fabric, and I cut 2 of those out, sewed the curved edge so that it made like a bag. Then I clipped and braided that seam so that when I turned it out, it would have a very nice smooth curve. After doing that, I took these pieces of foam that I got in a package about 2 years ago, and I had them and I thought, these will be useful one day, and I didn't know what for. And then the day came and I was right, and they were useful. So I cut 2 big pieces to create the shape of my croissant, and then I filled the rest of the space by just tearing the foam up into little pieces and shoving them in that bag, so it was just like a nice, tight, compact, juicy croissant. And then I sewed up the top, and then I added a big piece of twill tape so that I could tie around my waist. It took me about 1 episode of Ted Lasso to make this, start to finish, and at the end, I thought, good enough. So when I was done my bum pad, the next step was to make my cage crinoline. So to do this, I had some wire that I had gotten for free, and it is not really the correct boning to use, and also I really didn't have enough of it. But like I said, I wanted to spend no money on this. So the first thing I did was I kind of just made a circle out of the boning on the ground and stood in the middle. And based on photos of Keira Knightley in the film, I just kind of guessed how big I wanted it. Once I had that measurement, I then did the exact same thing with the hip. So when I have the measurement of my biggest hoop and my smallest hoop, I then figured out how much wire I had left and decided the lengths of all of the descending hoops based on that measurement. I am now encasing the hoop steel that I have cut in twill tape so that eventually, using more twill tape, I will be able to sew them all together to create the giant slinky that is a crinoline. So once I had all my hoop steel encased in twill tape, I then taped the ends together to create a hoop, and then I closed up the twill tape and made it all very nice and neat. And once I had all my hoops done, I went and sewed on a small strip of factory cotton around the edge of the bottom hoop, just like she has in the film. And then the next step was to attach all of my hoops together. So I marked around each hoop 6 times at an equal distance, and that marked where the vertical twill tape would be sewn onto the hoop each time. And there were going to be 6 pieces of twill tape. So then I sewed all those on, and then I used 1 more piece of twill tape at the top for a waistband, and I put on a couple of hook and bars for closures, and that is my hoop skirt complete. And because I didn't have enough hoop steel, really, mine is giving less so Barbie birthday cake vibes and more the mouth of that creature in Legend of Zelda who sits in the water and shoots stuff at you, if that makes sense. So my last undergarment to make was the petticoat, and here I am just ripping up strips of factory cotton to make my skirt. And my first two pieces are two very big rectangles, and those are going to become the base of the skirt. And then I'm ripping up some much longer but shorter pieces. That's an oxymoron. And those are going to be gathered down to become the ruffles all around the skirt. And once I had those strips cut out, I made a rounded shape on the front edges so it would look like the ruffles in the skirt in the movie. So once I had all the pieces that I needed, I went over to my sewing machine and I took my two big rectangles and sewed them into a tube, because what is a skirt if not a tube? And then I took that tube and I drew some horizontal lines around the tube to mark the placement of my ruffles. And now on to actually making the ruffles. The first thing I did was I hemmed the bottom of my ruffles with just a little tiny rolled hem. And then I serged the top edge of all of the ruffles except one. For the top ruffle, which is the only ruffle that you'll actually see the top edge, I pinked it to make it look more historically accurate because there were no sergers in 1850 whatever. But I don't really care about the other ones because you can't see them. So after I had all those serged, I went and added a gathering stitch on the top edges of all my ruffles, gathered them up, pinned them to the skirt, and then sewed them on. And the ruffles only go around about 3/4 of the skirt. The center front is bare. And this took a long time. It's really satisfying to see it like go quickly on film because it takes forever in real life. So once I had all the ruffles sewn on, I used some twill tape. There's a lot of twill tape in this project to finish the top edge. And then I fed another piece of twill tapeception, through that twill tape to create like a drawstring so I could draw the skirt around my waist. And then it was time to try it on. So I tried it on over top of my other undergarments and I decided the final length. And then I hemmed it and added the final ruffle, which goes all around the skirt. And then it was done. And that brings us to the end of all of our undergarments. I'm very excited. I knew that was going to be like the longest part. So I'm happy that that is over. So this brings us to the mock-up. So this is where I'm making my first kind of prototype of the jacket. I'm not going to do a mock-up of the skirt because it's just a big rectangle pleated in and I'm not really that worried about the fit. To make my jacket, the first step was to draft my pattern. And I use Winifred Aldrich's Metric Pattern Cutting for Women's Wear, 6th edition. And this is my kind of go-to for drafting patterns. I use her close-fitting basic block for this. Then when I had Winifred Aldrich's basic block complete, I was able to go in and make changes to actually make this pattern look like the dress. So I changed the front shoulder dart to 2 contour darts and shaped the waist. I then closed the back shoulder dart and added a princess seam. I divided the back at the waist to create the peplum pattern piece. And to make my peplum pattern piece, I just slashed and spread that bottom portion of the back bodice. And then once I had my peplum drafted, I then just altered the side of the front bodice so that the back and front side seams would match up. I then drafted a facing for the center front edge. And then when I was done my bodice, I went and drafted a 2-piece sleeve, also using Winifred Aldrich's book. And once I had all my pattern pieces done, it was time to cut them out of factory cotton, sew them together to make my muslin, and then have my first fitting. So for the fitting, I did up the center front with safety pins, and then I started looking at things I wanted to change. So I wanted to make my sleeve longer, and I also wanted to take it in. I also wanted my peplum to be more dramatic, so longer, and then with a more severe taper from front to back. I also changed the angle of the bottom of the center front so that it would show off the pleats of the skirt more like it does in the movie, and I also made the center front a bit shorter. Oh, and then the most annoying part of this fitting was doing the back, because the back was not sitting perfectly. I wanted to change the princess seam at my shoulder blade just a little bit, and to do that I had to take it off, kind of guess with my pins, and then put it on to see if that fixed the problem. And I did that a couple times until I felt like it was good enough. And when I was done that fitting, I made the changes to my pattern pieces, and then it was time to move on to actually making the dress. So now it was time to actually cut out my dress. So I cut it out of my good fabric, And then I always like to start with my darts. So I sewed all 4 darts on my center front, and then I interfaced and pressed my front facing, and then I moved on to my back. So I sewed the princess seams in the center back together. I then went to work on my peplum. So in pinning the peplum, I just kind of followed my heart. It's kind of hard to see her pleats in the film. You only see the back of the dress like once. Hers are a lot more kind of like easy breezy than mine. Mine are a bit more structured, but you know, what can you do? And then it was time to connect the fronts and backs by sewing the side seams and the shoulder seams. And then I prepared my sleeve pieces. So the first thing I did was make my cuff pattern. To do this, I just traced off the bottom of my sleeve pattern. Then I sewed my top sleeve to the bottom sleeve. I then sewed the cuff on and I pressed everything. And then I put a gathering stitch in the top to give the cap of the sleeve a nice shape. And then I had to just insert the sleeves into the bodice of the dress. So at this point, I had to finish the bottom of the peplum with bias tape. So I cut some strips of fabric on the diagonal, sewed them together, and I sewed those along the bottom edge, good sides together. And then I flipped the seam allowance of the bias tape to the inside and stitched in the ditch. The last thing I had to do was really put the collar on. And I actually put the collar on completely wrong. I didn't notice in the film the bow is already pre-tied and then the collar just snaps closed. I did not do that. I did it so I actually had to tie it. Their way is obviously so much smarter because the bow just stays cute at all times. Mine, you have to like tie it cute. And it was not always looking cute. So after sewing my collar on, I slip stitched the inside so it looked nice and neat, and that was done. So the next step was to put in buttonholes, and I did my buttonholes on a little domestic, so not historically accurate. I love your work, Tolstoy, but not enough to hand bound some buttonholes. I am sure there are people on this website who are doing that, and God bless them. That is like the nice thing about life, is that there's always somebody doing what you're doing, but better. And I think you could look at that as a negative, but I just see it as taking a lot of pressure off. You're never gonna be the best, so you might as well just like have a good time. And to me, having a good time is not sewing hand-bound buttonholes unless someone is paying me a lot of money. So here I am doing my little machine buttonholes. So then I just sewed my buttons on, and that is the jacket complete. So now it is time to sew the skirt. And just like the petticoat, the skirt is really just a big tube made of 2 rectangles. So I sewed my big tube up, and I used all the fabric I had left because I knew I needed as much length as possible for the bustle, and I didn't have that much length left. And then I pleated the waist, and I did that like I did for the peplum. I just kind of followed my heart until I thought it looked right. Then I quickly sewed on a waistband, and then I sewed a placket so I could get it over my hips. And then I added some hook and eye closures so I could close the skirt up. And then it came to the bustle, and this is the part that I was kind of dreading because I knew I could not get this to look like the film solely because I don't have enough fabric. So I just did the best I could. And all the bustle really is just, I just folded the fabric in on itself and pinned it in place. My bustle is like a very sad excuse for a bustle. It's honestly just an anemic, sad fold in the fabric. I wish I had the actual fabric to make the bustle. This is like the most disappointing part of this dress, honestly. But it is what it is. Let's all focus on anything else, please. And then I decided the front length. I really had to guess because I was doing this myself. It'd be much easier if you had someone to mark it, but I was just doing it by myself, so it's fine. Once I decided my length, I then took it to, this is not the way to do this, but I don't have a dress form at my house, so I took my skirt and I put it on a hanger, and I used some safety pins to try to make it as even as possible along the top so that I could then try to make a nice even hem on the bottom. And here is a very cinematic shot of my skirt hanging from the curtain rod and me trying to make it the hem even. And I did an okay job. This is not my best work. I then, once I was happy enough with it, I took it over to a table and kind of evened it out, and then I pressed along that hemline and cut off the excess so I had a little seam allowance, and then I just went and hemmed my dress. I hemmed it in bed while watching TV, which I believe is the best way to hand sew anything. And that was pretty late at night, so the next morning I went and ironed my hem, and then it was time to try it on. And at this point, I put it on, everything was good. I did realize the front was a little too long and the back was a little too short. But the idea of taking it all off and fixing it and then putting it all back on was too much for me. So I was like, oh, it's not that bad. And it wasn't until I walked outside that I was tripping over it. It's too goddamn long. But that brings us to pretty much the completion of this dress. And now it's time to go out in the world and take some pictures. Here's a video of me right before I went outside. Time to go humiliate myself. This old man is watching me. Now, the dress is done. That part of my life is over. It is now sitting in a closet where it will remain for who knows how long.